Scripture reading this evening is from Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verses 12 through 17. Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verses 12 through 17. Then I turned my thoughts to consider wisdom, and also madness and folly. What more can the king's successor do than what has already been done? I saw that wisdom is better than folly, just as light is better than darkness. The wise man has eyes in his head, while the fool walks in the darkness. But I came to realize that the same fate overtakes them both. Then I thought in my heart, the fate of the fool will overtake me also. What then do I gain by being wise? I said in my heart, this too is meaningless. For the wise man, like the fool, will not be long remembered. In days to come, both will be forgotten. Like the fool, the wise man too must die. So I hated life because the work that is done under the sun was grievous to me. All of it meaningless. All of it is meaningless, a chasing after the wind.
Thank you, Justin. I apologize if you can't hear me. I'll try to speak loudly. This evening, we're going to be concluding our kind of three-part series in Ecclesiastes. And I appreciate your patience in this. It's just been kind of an experimental thing where I wanted to look at these different sections in Ecclesiastes where Solomon says that a certain thing is vanity and striving after wind. And it's autobiographical in nature. He recounts a time where he searches something out. And he comes to the conclusion that it's all vanity and striving after wind. It's pointless. Vanity, we talked about, is the idea of a breath or a vapor. And this Hebrew word is even often translated as an idol. And the striving after wind is he's chasing something that he cannot catch. That he can't get it. No matter how hard he grabs it, it's not there. And so he's trying to search for something. And we've seen in the last two lessons that Solomon kind of comes to this conclusion the conclusion at least we come to from reading it, that these good things don't have as much value when you take them apart from God. That wisdom isn't just wisdom when you take it apart from God. He sought out wisdom, he found it, but yet it was still striving after wind. And so tonight, we're going to see a little bit of this, but we're actually going to take it one step further. We're going to peel back another piece of the layer here and see not only do these things not have value, but we actually see why Solomon is searching in the first place. Why he's searching for these things. Why he's searching for answers. And so in Ecclesiastes chapter 2, as was read for us, Solomon is concerned with his legacy, with what comes after him. Have you ever thought about that? Have you ever wondered about your own legacy? What will things happen once you're gone? I know some of you own businesses. What's going to happen to your business when you're not there? Will the people who run it in a way that will make you happy? Some of you own property and you've built up your homes, you refurnish them, you've rebuilt cabinets and kitchens and bedrooms, and you've tore up carpet and you put carpet in, and you've built up your homes. But what's going to happen to your property when you're gone? Will it be taken care of in a way that pleases you, or will the next person just run it into the ground? And if the next person does run it into the ground, does that mean that your life was meaningless in the first place? These are the things that Solomon is really grappling with. What's going to happen with him and his kingdom and all that he's done once he's gone. And now he's going back to his wisdom. We read at the beginning of chapter 12 that he's considering wisdom and madness and folly. It's really the idea of wisdom and foolishness again. He's going to wisdom and wanting to know, can wisdom help him in establishing and seeing out his legacy? Does it help him in this? Does it give him the power? Does wisdom have the power to ensure one's legacy? Or does it not have that? Now, I hope that you've seen in this, and I hope by the end it'll become apparent, that in this text that we've seen, because we've actually gone through a block of text here, starting in chapter 1 and verse 12, and going all the way through now to chapter 2, verse 17, I hope you'll see that there's a progression. That Solomon in the first section was searching out wisdom as an answer in and of itself. And it didn't give him the answer he wanted, even when he got wisdom. And so then he moved on to pleasure and indulgence as a way of, as he put, testing his heart. And testing here is not the idea of seeing how far something will bend until it breaks. It's the idea of figuring it out. And so he knows wisdom is not an answer in and of itself. He knows that pleasure now is not an answer in and of itself, so he's going to use pleasure as a way to find another answer. And it still doesn't give him the answer he's searching for. And so now he's turned back to wisdom and is going to seek out his legacy and whether or not wisdom has helped him with this. And this is kind of where we are in Ecclesiastes. And you'll remember, for some of you who were here and maybe some of you who weren't, when we look at Ecclesiastes, we know that it's dealing with many universal aspects of the human experience. A human being's whole life. That it doesn't really matter if you were living 3,000 years ago when Solomon wrote this in Israel, or you're living today, it's still difficult to deal with times of war and times of peace. We have to make sense of this. We have to make sense of how to mourn properly and how to be happy in a proper way as well. Now, starting in our text in chapter 2 and verse 12, we're going to read through to the first part of verse 14. Solomon writes, "So I turned to consider wisdom and madness and folly. For what can the man do who comes after the king? Only what has already been done. Then I saw that there is more gain in wisdom than in folly, as there is more gain in light than in darkness. The wise person has his eyes in his head, but the fool walks in darkness." Now I want us to end there because the second part of verse 14 really turns a page. And he goes on to another idea. Now he's asking in verse 12 that he's considering wisdom and madness and folly, and asks this question: what can the man do who comes after the king? So Solomon, as you'll remember in this previous section, when he's searching out pleasure and indulgence, he builds homes for himself. Many homes. He builds self-sustaining gardens. And he has slaves, and the slaves are having families within his home. So not only is he the king of Israel, he also now has this other little world he's building. And logically, after he's been building this, he now wonders what's going to happen to it. What's going to happen to all that he's worked for and all that he's toiled for? Can he make sure it keeps going, or is it going to be handed over to someone else? In fact, he's built so much. He says in chapter 2, verse 9, says, "So I became great and surpassed all who were before me in Jerusalem." He builds more than anyone else has ever seen at this time. And he wants to know what's going to happen to it. And can his wisdom guide him in this? Can his wisdom ensure that the one who comes after him will take care of it? Because he asks, for what can the man do who comes after the king? Now, the way I see this is actually very similar to like bartering. Because when you're bartering with someone, you're trying to reduce the price, it's kind of like a game. You try to make sure you say all the right things at just the right time in just the right way to get the price down to where you want it. And now I think Solomon, in a very similar way, is wondering, can he be so wise that he makes all the right decisions at all the right times in just the right ways that his legacy will continue? Does wisdom have that power? Can he have that power using his wisdom? This is what he's talented with. This is his talents. When we have times of trouble, we turn to our talents. And Solomon is very talented at being wise. He's wanting to know, can his wisdom help him in this? Because human beings are very concerned with our legacies. We think about this, right? We wonder this. What's going to happen to us when we're gone? What are people going to think about us when we're gone? All that we've worked for and all that we've done, what's going to happen to it? Because we have a hard time letting go of this. and letting it go on its own. Now, I knew a man who owned a newspaper, and it was quite remarkable. He was the only full-time employee. He had a couple of people who helped out here and there, but he owned the newspaper, wrote almost the entire thing, took almost every photograph, and he edited all on his computer, sent it to the publisher. He went and picked it up and distributed it himself. This man worked 7 days a week on his newspaper, but he didn't have God, and so this was his identity. This was what he did. And I knew him later on in his life, after it had been successful, it's made money, it's doing very well. And he had had multiple offers of people to buy it, and he didn't want to give it up. Because he's very concerned, he told me, he's very concerned with what will happen to it when he's gone. Will it continue? And Solomon, I think, is very concerned. He doesn't necessarily want to let go of the reins to see what will happen, because he doesn't want his legacy now to end. So he asks this question, what can the man do who comes after the king? Now this is an important question, because what Solomon is now about to say is answering this question. What can the man do who comes after the king? And he says, first of all, he can only do what's already been done. That's actually very true. Rulers of nations aren't all that different from one another. Solomon, the decisions he's making 3,000 years ago in Jerusalem, a culture very unlike our own even today, let alone 3,000 years ago, the decision he's making are very similar decisions that our presidents are making today. How can I help my people? How can I protect them? How can I help them during times of famine? What should I do about times of war and times of peace? About how do I trade with other nations? We trade with nations today just like they did back then. We may deposit our money digitally, but we still trade. We still have to have diplomatic relations. A ruler, a king, can only do what has already been done. He can't do something that has never been done at all. There is no doing something that is totally original, both in wisdom and in foolishness. A king can only do the things that wise kings have done, as well as the things that foolish kings have done. So then he goes on in verse 13 and says, then I saw that there is more gain in wisdom than in folly, as there is more gain in light than in darkness. Now this makes sense. You ask the question, what can the man do who comes after the king? First of all, he can only do what's already been done. If he can only do what's already been done, it's better to do the wise things that have already been done than the foolish things. You don't want to do the foolish things that have already been done. Your options as a ruler are limited. Now, then he says, I saw there's more gain in wisdom than in folly, as there's more gain in light than in darkness. You have to use your imagination and really think of this conceptually, that the path a king walks down is the exact same path that every other king must walk down. It has a definite start and a definite beginning, but it's better to walk down the path with the lights on than with the lights off. If you walk down the path foolishly, it's like you're walking down the path with the lights off. You're going to bumble around, you're going to walk into things. A person who walks down the path with the lights off doesn't know the consequences of their actions. They don't know the choices that they can and cannot make. Whereas a person who is wise and is walking down this path knows their options. Now he continues in verse 14 and says, the wise person has his eyes in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. The wise person has his eyes in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. So the fool doesn't know his own consequences. He must walk down the path as every other king has walked down. There's no doing something original. A fool doesn't know his options, but a wise one knows his options, which actually, the wisdom then comes from being able to see within your own mind what's going to happen as a king. Now, this same principle applies not just to kings, but to a lot of situations. I mean, like husbands and wives. I'm a husband, but I can't be a husband that is totally original. I can only be a husband as a way that every other person has ever been a husband. I can do it foolishly or wisely. I can walk down the path of being a husband with the lights on or with the lights off. And the way you see this is by having your eyes in your head, which brings about a very important principle, which is that what we put into our minds are our options when it comes time to make a decision. Say that again. What we put into our minds are our options when it comes time to make a decision. If we want to make foolish and worldly options, we will put foolish and worldly things into our minds. If we want to make wise options, we will put wise things into our minds. A great example of this is the temptation of Eve. Eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil was never an option until it was put into her mind by Satan. And then it became an option for her to make in a moment when she had to make a decision. If we want to walk down these paths of lives in a very practical way, as husbands, as wives, as sons and daughters in our occupations, we should put wise things into our minds so that we can make wise decisions. Now, getting back to our text, he's looking at this question, what can the man do who comes after the king? Well, first of all, he can only do what's already been done. Okay, so if he can only do what's already been done, it's better to do the wise things that have already been done than the foolish things. Okay, and then he continues, though, in verse 14, and says, and yet I perceived that the same event happens to all of them. Something changes now. In examining this question, he perceives the same event happens to all of them. And it's hard to tell immediately, but Solomon is totally crushed and devastated at this conclusion. It totally devastates all that he's been thinking and working toward. You look in verse 17 and he says, so I hated life. This conclusion devastates him. That his wisdom can't help him. This is his identity, it's his legacy, and his wisdom doesn't help him at all. He can't have the power that controls what comes after him. In fact, he says, it's not in our reading, but starting in verse 18, he says, I hated all my toil in which I toil under the sun, seeing that I must leave it to the man who will come after me, and who knows whether he will be wise or a fool. Yet he will be master of all for which I toiled and used my wisdom under the sun. This also is vanity. So I turned about and gave my heart up to despair over all the toil of my labors under the sun, because sometimes a person who has toiled with wisdom and knowledge and skill must leave everything to be enjoyed by someone who did not toil for it. This also is vanity and a great evil. He's devastated. His wisdom can't control his legacy. He has to give it to someone else who may just run it straight into the ground. He can't make all the right decisions at just the right times to control this. He doesn't have that power. And wisdom doesn't have that power either. So now Solomon must ask the question, is he wise for emphasizing wisdom so much? Is that wise of him? You remember God gave him an option and said, you can choose anything you want. Solomon chose to be wise. He said, grant me wisdom so I could lead your people. If you're a foolish person who is trying to be wise, are you a wise fool or are you just a fool? He's emphasizing wisdom, and yet wisdom isn't giving him what he's searching for. And it's not manipulating his options. He has all the money and all the authority and all the power in Israel at this time, and yet he can't manipulate even his own legacy. It's beyond his control. Now in verse 15 he says, then I said in my heart, what happens to the fool will happen to me also. Why then have I been so very wise? And I said in my heart that this also is vanity. Now this is interesting. He says that what happens to the fool will happen to me also. He expected something different to happen to him just because he's wise. This same event that's going to overtake the foolish person that now overtakes the wise as well, he didn't expect to overtake him. He thought he was going to escape it. And yet he can't. It's going to overtake him all the same. He assumed that being wise automatically deserved better. And this is something we actually assume today as well. We assume a wise, educated person automatically is more successful in their job, makes more money, is happier. And then we also assume that an uneducated person is poor and they're unhappy. And that's not really what we see in reality at all. In fact, we see people who are very educated and have higher degrees who are very foolish. We see people who make a lot of money who are very foolish, and we see people who are very poor who are actually very wise. This is an assumption that Solomon's making that we make as well, and we don't really have this assumption grounded in anything. It doesn't come from God. Solomon didn't get this from the law of Moses. I mean, God said that if you obey God, God will bless you. He never said if you get a degree, you will make more money than anyone else. This is an assumption that Solomon's making, and it's one that we make as well. And then he continues in verse 16. He says, "For of the wise, as of the fool, there is no enduring remembrance, seeing that in the days to come, all will have been long forgotten." Oh, now we're getting somewhere. Now we're starting to see what Solomon's really after. He's not just after wisdom is successful and foolishness isn't. He's bothered by the fact that he won't be remembered, and wisdom doesn't guarantee this. His wisdom can't guarantee that he's going to be remembered. People hate this. People hate the idea of being forgotten, don't we? I mean, rulers especially, presidents of the United States actually hire historians to be with them during their presidency to make sure that their presidency is accurately recorded for the history books. People don't want to be forgotten, and they don't want to be misremembered. Not that long ago, Bailey and I went to Disneyland, and then when you're standing in this open square before you go into either of the two parks, I look down, and there are these bricks with people's names and their family names all engraved on them. I'm just standing there staring at them. I must have looked like a fool. But I stood there and I read all these names. And I was looking at these and I was wondering to myself, what is it in people that makes them want to engrave their names on things like this? And what's really funny is that now, at this moment, I couldn't tell you a single one of their names. I don't know any of them. And I read a number of those. I couldn't tell you a single one. In fact, people who do noble things are often forgotten, aren't they? Like World War II. World War II was a noble war. There are tens of millions of people who died, probably more Russian soldiers than any other country, and yet I couldn't tell you, 10 different soldiers who died in combat, let alone 10 Russian soldiers. People are forgotten. And this bothers Solomon. He says, "For of the wise as of the fool there is no enduring remembrance, seeing that in the days to come all will have been long forgotten." He is trying to escape something that he thought his wisdom would allow him to escape, and he thought he wouldn't be forgotten in his legacy. He could just leave it there. And people would always say, "Oh, this is Solomon's gardens. We remember him. He was such a great person." And he can't control that. And then he continues in verse 16 and says, "How the wise dies just like the fool." Oh, now we're getting somewhere. He doesn't just want to be remembered. He doesn't just think his wisdom will make him be remembered for eternity. He thinks his wisdom is an escape from death. This is the thing that devastates him. You go back to verse 14, he says, "Yet I perceive that the same event happens to all of them," and this is what devastates him and crushes him. The fact that his wisdom means that he's going to die just like a foolish person. It's not an escape. He can't escape it. He doesn't deserve not to die. He's going to die all the same. And once you see this, that Solomon is trying to escape death through his legacy and using his wisdom, we see this everywhere, don't we? People are always trying to do this, to either escape death or distract themselves from it. We hate the idea of dying. We want to live forever. There's something in us that yearns and longs for immortality. And Solomon is trying to escape death using his wisdom. Now we continue in verse 17, and he says, "So I hated life, because what is done under the sun was grievous to me, for all is vanity and a striving after wind." He hated life. He wasn't just frustrated, he wasn't just annoyed, he felt wronged. Like this was an injustice. That he was going to die as well. He couldn't escape death with his wisdom. It was going to overtake him just like anyone else. See, Solomon wanted to escape death, but he wanted it on his terms. He wanted to escape death, but he wanted it on his terms. If I just get wise enough, I can escape it. And that's what people do. We want to escape it, but we want it on our terms. If I'm just morally good enough, I can escape it. If I'm just wise enough, I can escape it. You know, if I just make it on the right sports team, I'll be in the Hall of Fame with all the other sports players. If I'm just a good enough musician, I'll be in the Hall of Fame with the other musicians. I'll be there with the other actors, the other writers, the other craftsmen, the men of my trade. If I'm just good enough, I can escape death. I can be an immortal, but I can be it on my own terms. And you can't escape it. The thing that we're good at, the thing that Solomon's good at, his wisdom doesn't just automatically allow him to escape it. It does not ensure his legacy, and he hated life. He hated life because he didn't get what he wanted through his wisdom. Now this actually brings us to our next point, which is quite an amazing point, I think. As we begin to wrap up our series here on Ecclesiastes, we've looked at Solomon, we've looked at his pursuit of answers. We know he's searching for something. He went to try to find it in wisdom and it wasn't there, and he tried to seek pleasure to figure himself out and it wasn't there. And now he's turning back to wisdom, looking at his legacy, and he's still not finding what he's wanting. But yet his heart is yearning for something. Because the human heart yearns for these things that God has put into our hearts. See, Ecclesiastes is only half the story. The other half comes with Jesus. The reason Solomon is seeking something is because God puts things into our hearts to seek. One of the greatest passages that is so changed my own theology, my understanding of God and human nature, is Ecclesiastes chapter 3 in verse 11, where Solomon writes about God, "He has made everything beautiful in its time. Also he has put eternity into man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end." You know why Solomon was searching for something? Because God put it into his heart to search in the first place. He was searching for it in wisdom and he never found it. And he's searching for it in pleasure and indulgence and in more wisdom in his legacy, and he never found it because God puts things into our hearts so that we'll seek God. And human beings have the horrible habit of seeking God in all the wrong places. All of these things that Solomon is seeking, we find these answers in God and in Jesus. Solomon is seeking wisdom. He yearns to be wise because that will answer his questions. We turn over to Colossians chapter 2. And in Colossians chapter 2, starting in verse 1, Paul writes, For I want you to know how great a struggle I have for you and for all those at Laodicea and for all who have not seen me face to face, that their hearts may be encouraged, being knit together in love, to reach all the riches of full assurance and understanding and the knowledge of God's mystery, which is Christ, in whom are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. Solomon didn't know it. He's seeking after God's Messiah. Because only God's Messiah can give us these answers, these longings, these yearnings we have in our heart. I mean, Solomon is seeking after pleasure. You turn over to Isaiah chapter 55. And in Isaiah chapter 55, starting in verse 1, we read, "Come, everyone who thirsts, come to the waters, and he who has no money, come buy and eat. Come, buy wine and milk without money and without price. Why do you spend your money for that which is not bread, and your labor for that which does not satisfy? Listen diligently to me, and eat what is good, and delight yourselves in rich food. Incline your ear and come to me. Hear that your soul may live, and I will make with you an everlasting covenant, my steadfast, sure love for David." This new covenant we have is through God's Messiah. People are seeking after God, but they're seeking after God in all the wrong places. Seeking after God in wisdom and education, in pleasure. The only real pleasure comes from God. Otherwise, it's all vanity and striving after wind. He says in Isaiah 55, "Why do you spend your money for that which is not bread and your labors for that which does not satisfy?" That's all Solomon was doing when he was seeking out pleasure. And Solomon was seeking after immortality because God has put eternity into man's heart. And we read, you turn over to John chapter 11. In John chapter 11, starting in verse 25, Jesus says, "I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die." Everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Don't we yearn for immortality? Isn't it put into our hearts? The great message of Ecclesiastes is not just the wisdom of Solomon, but all of what it's pointing to. And it's all pointing to Jesus. That these longings and these yearnings of our hearts that we seek in all the wrong places are only satisfied in Jesus. We long for pleasure. We long for happiness. We long to be forgiven and to be purified. And all of this comes to us through Jesus and restoring our relationship to God. We need to understand that when people are searching in our lives today and they've made good things ultimate things, they're searching for God in the wrong place. When people have made good things ultimate things, they're searching for God in the wrong place. People do this with wisdom and they do it with pleasure, and they're going to do it with their legacies. And it's our job to show them that all of the longings of their heart are satisfied in Jesus. Now, this is our series on Ecclesiastes. And at this time, we offer an invitation to anyone who wants to learn more of why Jesus is the longings of our heart. Anyone who wants to come to Christ and to be truly satisfied in a way that nothing in this world can satisfy us. If there's anyone who wants to be baptized or needs prayers or needs anything at all, we ask that you would talk to us or come forward now while we stand and sing this invitation song.
Have thine affections been nailed to the cross? Is thy heart